Welcome back to our Entre Nous podcast. Today, for those that are thinking about buying a house in France, of course, and other things such as succession, you might have to deal with a notaire. Today, I've got a good friend, Maître Vincent Rairoux, with us on the podcast, who's going to tell us a bit more about the role of a notaire and what it is that he does as a profession and how you as a client would need to use that service. So, Vincent, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for your invitation.
Yeah, cool. And thanks so much for coming. So, if we had to explain what the role of a notaire is to someone that's never lived in France before, what does a notaire do?
A notaire is a lawyer, but compared to other countries, for instance, the US or the UK, it's a lawyer who represents both parties, usually in the scope of a real estate transaction or other matters like family or estate law.
And it's a mandatory thing, right? You can't buy a house or sell a house in France without going through a notaire.
Correct.
Yeah.
We make sure that everything is right from a legal point of view and that the buyer gets all the information, the key information he needs.
And I think one thing that we point out with what we do at French Connections is often we actually act on top of the notaire as helping the client through that process, because people sometimes will only have one notaire because the sales agent has said, oh, just deal with one notaire, and thinking that it will be less expensive maybe to have one person instead of two. But that's not entirely the case. You can appoint any notaire really that you want wherever you are in France, as long as you're assermenté and you've got the title.
Exactly. It's not mandatory to have your own notary. One notary, as said before, can
do the
assist both parties if they like. But if the buyer or the seller prefers to be assisted by his own notary, that's up to him to decide. And then, I'm not going to go into details, but we split the job between both notarial offices, and we work together to have the best possible contract, meeting both expectations and
for the viewers, I think that's important to mention. There's several stages. I mean, a big part of what people will be watching today are thinking about is buying a house. And so when you're buying a house in France, let's break that down. What do? They've got to conclude a deal with the agent or with the seller directly or on a price, and then they go to see a notaire. Mm-hmm. They find a notaire. You can find a notaire on the French government website. You're listed, aren't you?
Of course, there is a list, an official list.
Yeah.
But there are also a list where you have specifically, for instance, if you're looking for a notary who speaks your language, English, for instance, but could be German or Spanish, you could also search a notary who speaks and who is accustomed to.
And you yourself, you're recommended by the US Embassy in France, right? Your firm.
Right. Yes. Correct. You can actually contact any notary wherever located. We are not bound by a specific
to one area. Yeah.
And nowadays, the whole real estate purchase process can work remotely. So
that's a key one, because some notaires don't really like DocuSign, right? It's like something that can be quite difficult in certain regions. And that's important for viewers to know. They can, if the notaire says, no, I don't want to do a remote signature, you can find one that will.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's, I've heard it an awful lot with clients that say, oh, we won't, or they won't accept funds from currency converting. You've got to, the notaire hasn't every power, especially if there's this kind of aspect of you could actually go and get your own. It's not really going to cost you that much more. If anything, it's just the fees, maybe 450, 700 euros.
The fees of a notary are defined on a national level.
So this is what we're going to say. It's equal.
It's equal. Wherever you go, in a small village or in Paris, it would cost you approximately the same.
And so buying that house, talk us through that. You've got the purchase, you've agreed on a price, you've found your notaire that allows a DocuSign so you can appoint somebody to sign on your behalf, you'll do a DocuSign, etc. What are the stages of the contract? What happens when you're selling or buying a house in France?
Step 1, you make an offer. Step 2, you sign a pre-sale agreement. That pre-sale agreement where you define the rules of the game, what are the conditions to close the deal. Yep. Usually is the financing, of course, is the most important one.
Yeah.
The pre-sale agreement is...
So just a word on the financing. People could choose to pay cash,
right?
In which case there are certain rules that apply in terms of delays to be able to not buy the house, etc. I think that the delays are the same, but there are things that will not be quite as flexible as if you're financing, correct? So if you're financing a property through a mortgage and you don't get the mortgage, there are different clauses then in the contract.
European law protects, the consumer law protects the buyer who needs a mortgage. So if he does everything as we have defined it in the contract, and unfortunately the bank is not granting that loan, he can withdraw from the deal, and he doesn't lose any money.
As long as it's in a period of time, though, that's defined.
As long as he spreads the timing and the condition we define in the pre-sale agreement, he can withdraw. French bankers may work a bit different than in the US or in Germany or in UK.
It takes longer.
Well, actually, I have the feeling that in other countries, listening to, for instance, American clients, they ask first, they secure first the mortgage, and then when they know exactly the budget they have and the capacity of they have, then they look for the right property. In France,
other way around, really.
It's a bit the way around. First, you make an offer that gets accepted, and then you ask yourself, how am I going to finance that property, more or less?
But I think the key part here is that once that finance is defined, there are it's called a promesse de vente, un compromis de vente. So that's the name of the actual pre-contract, and that will be agreed by both notaires if there are two notaires.
Correct.
This is where you might negotiate a little bit more on the terms. You want the house to be emptied, or you want to make sure that you can keep a piece of furniture. One key tip that I usually give to my clients is to put, even if they don't plan to do this, is always to put a faculté de substitution in the contract, which is literally means a faculty to substitute to somebody else.
Correct.
And in this case, a company could be for planning. And that's what a notaire does as well.
Correct.
Your role should be to give that information from a planning perspective as well.
I have in mind a recent client who wanted to set up an American LLC, a company to purchase the French property, but he was stressed, thinking that he had to set up the company first with the risk of losing the property.
Yes.
And I could reassure him by saying, no, both things can move forward simultaneously, because we will have indeed this faculté de substitution, this capacity to change the final owner, and during the period of time between the pre-sale agreement and the final deed of sale, the closing, that's when we set up the company. And in the end, what counts is
the last part,
exactly.
So the l'acte de vente. But am I right in thinking as well? And so a lot of my clients will refer me to an Australian client of mine. If she's watching, she'll laugh. She referred me as a bush notaire. So because I do this so often, I kind of got the knowledge, if you like, that's been just installed through buying so many properties myself personally and going through the process so often. But one thing that I learned recently, or probably is not news to you, but to me it was, is that if you actually buy as a company, you don't have a droit de rétractation. Is that true? So the 10 days that you usually have a cooling off period is gone if it's a company purchase.
Correct.
So that's
if from stage one, it's a company that's going to purchase the property, or if it's an individual, but it's not a house, it's not an apartment, but for instance, a store.
Yeah. So there's just no cooling off.
There is no cooling off.
So you'd be better off, even if you are going to create a company,
Correct.
to buy as an individual. So you've got your cooling off with a faculté de substitution. Be very careful. You need to speak to our friend Géraud about buying a company, buying a property with a foreign company, because there's things that could be dangerous there from a tax point of view, corporation tax in particular. But that's another topic. But coming back to the process of purchasing, which I think is what will interest most people, we've got that compromis de vente. What is the difference, by the way, between a compromis de vente and a promesse de vente? Is there any?
There is a difference, but I would have to give you
okay, so it's the same thing, because sometimes
so
notaires refer to it as a different term. It's
the same thing. That's okay. What you have to.
That's the easy. Thank you for the easy answer. That's great.
It's the same thing.
So you've got this promesse de vente. You put your faculté de substitution. You've got your cooling off period. You've chosen a type of funding, whether it be cash or a mortgage. If it's a mortgage, we understand that we've got a little bit more flexibility after the cooling off period. If the mortgage wasn't approved, potentially we could back out without any penalties. Mm-hmm. But typically, once that compromis de vente is signed or promesse de vente is signed, there's a deposit to pay. Is that correct? Right. Around 10%, something like that.
5 or 10%.
And that's what you potentially lose if you do what most notaires say, si on fait un caprice, which is if you throw your toys at the pram, you don't want to buy the house anymore. Potentially, that's what you could be subject to losing.
Correct, but because the seller is losing time in a certain way. So that's why we
have this clause.
Have kind of penalty.
Sometimes there's no deposit required, though. There's just still the clause in the contract, but the seller can trust you and just doesn't want a deposit.
It's not mandatory, of course. So in particular, if it's a sale occurring between
people that know each other.
You know each other, neighbors, friends, family members, of course, they're not going...
Or a small amount sometimes.
Or if it's a small amount.
So no matter the amount, that's done. We've got that first stage done. There's going to be a period of usually 3 months typically between that signature and then l'acte authentique, the final part of the contract. Mm-hmm. So for those that maybe have never done this before and never even looked into it, basically the pre-contract is just a copy of what the final contract will be once all of the searches, the time, all of the things that have to happen. And I don't want to bore people with this, but for instance, if you buy an agricultural land, mm-hmm. there's something called the SAFER, which I won't even ask for the acronym because we tried to look for it the other day and it didn't really make sense. But this is the agricultural land that has to be given as basically a first refusal to the agricultural chamber mm-hmm. before, and that could be just you've got a field around the back mm-hmm. of your house, right? So this search would have to be done, usually paid for, mm-hmm. Potentially. And then there's also things like if you're buying a property in a town or city, there could be a droit de préemption urbain.
A preemptive right.
Yeah.
If, for instance...
The mairie could buy the house. So even though you've signed that document and you've got that compromis de vente, there are still some cases where parts of the property could be disputed. It's actually happened to me once.
It's very rare, but it can happen.
I'm still gutted. I was working on the file for a whole year, and the mairie, after just before the end, said no, we want to buy the property, and I had to lose it. It was gone.
Right. But the mayor has to give a reason. For instance, he wants to build a school or hospital.
Can happen.
It can happen. That's one of the conditions.
And the only other condition is death to get out of the contract. Right? If you're the buyer, if one of you dies,
right. Of course.
Unfortunately, you can't force the sale. But if the sellers die, they have to complete the sale.
Yeah, correct.
So really, what we're saying is to reassure people that compromis de vente, once it's signed...
It's actually the most important.
Yeah, it's actually quite... It's very securing for the buyer in a way. I think that's the seller can't just say, no, we're not selling it anymore.
Correct.
There's another thing that I think viewers will probably really like to know is that there's this element where if the property was damaged, if it caught fire, that's the only other time as well where you could refuse it, right? You could say, look, I don't want the insurance claim.
You could still get the compensation money from the insurance.
You
and
could still
rebuild.
keep the deal,
Yes.
but you've got the choice.
You
These
get
are the
choice.
only, so death, natural disaster, and potentially if you've got a loan, not getting your loan are the only things once those 10 days have passed that will get you out of
Correct.
jail-free zone, right?
Correct.
or costing you money.
Yes.
And the seller, again, this is quite a personal question, Vincent, but I think I feel it's very important to share that with audiences. In my experience of buying, myself and for clients, French people, as in French people selling properties, are very aware, very much respect the notaire, the rules, the 10-year warranties that they have to provide. They know that they can be taken to court for vice caché, vice en dol, etc. There are terms for that. So usually buying from a French person means that there's an awful lot of respect in the deal, in the sale. And I think sometimes if you're buying from an international person that doesn't understand maybe French law quite as much and how much it protects the buyer, because it does protect the buyer nearly more than the seller in a way, this whole contract, doesn't it?
It depends. It's equalized.
It should be equal, but I do
equal.
feel that it's very securing. I think I'm talking about this because people are sat in the USA or in the UK where house sales fall through all the time. Like it's very common for them to buy something and then find out there's a massive hole in the roof that, you know, the seller knew about, and then there's nothing they can do. In France, that's not how it works.
Yeah, exactly. It's European law, consumer law again, who obliges the buyer to get a lot of information.
And that's the role of the
different
notaire
topics,
to talk you through that.
Exactly, the different topics are increasing, and the information.
So there's more and more
the buyer
protection.
gets information on a lot of subjects.
And the
Of
diagnostic.
topics, I mean. The technical reports on lead, on asbestos, on termites.
And that's
depending-
mandatory, and the seller has to pay for that.
Correct. But there is no overall inspection. That's an important thing to understand. When you buy property in France, basically, if it's not a professional seller, you buy it
Sight
as it
is seen.
stands. You have to check it. And if
With
you want...
its good parts and its bad parts.
Correct.
So in that case, we've got a very good method in a way, quite a long one, but quite a protective one for everyone. You would come and help with your team, of course, make sure that all of these parts are understood. Potentially I would come along and maybe even give a further voice of reassuring. You get closer to that acte de vente.
Mm-hmm.
And that acte de vente is now the real deal. This is, everything is passed. All of the people that wanted to buy have said they didn't want it, the mairie, the SAFER, etc. Now you're going to go for signature, and this is now going to be your property once the signature is done. The funds, let's talk about that for a second, because quite often clients haven't yet opened a bank account. So the first thing to do, you don't need a French bank account in France to buy a house in France. That's the first one, okay? Second one, you can do a distance purchase, right? It's possible.
It's possible. But
Not easy, maybe, to get always notaires to do that, but it's possible.
The only thing I always say is you're not purchasing a baguette. So of course, it's reasonable to visit the property.
Of
just
course,
the
but
day
you could visit it and then... I often would also argue that it's worth visiting before you do the acte de vente one last time, to check that things have gone and it is how you.
The furniture there is still there, and there is no water leak.
Because it happens. And again, I think for me, in my experience, buying from French people tends to be that they're like super cautious. They're leaving you wood. I mean, I moved into my house in France, and they filled up the cans. They made sure a plumber came, switched all of the water back on. I think French people are very caring of their properties and emotionally attached to the property as well, right? But in that general space, that transfer can be done to the notaire, so that to your notaire usually. It's the notaire.
It's mandatory.
Yeah, so that's transferred within 72 hours before purchase. Maybe more, you would advise.
Generally, we anticipate that topic, but The important thing is that the money
It's got to be in funds cleared.
is on the notarial account the day before the closing.
International money laundering, something called TrackFind, or TrackFind, I guess, if you were saying it the English way. That also is something that sometimes notaires ask about, sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. They should ask probably all the time, I guess. And this is just a declaration of where the money's come from.
We have to ask
Yeah.
the client wherever he is, and it doesn't depend neither on the country of origin nor
Yeah.
the amount of the funds. We have to ask the client to document where the money
It's come from.
is
So
coming
that
from.
could be just a proof that it's transferred from their bank, from the house sale, from inheritance. They just have to testify. And what would that look like? Usually a letter signed on their behalf or something along those lines?
No, it's a bit more than that.
Okay.
It would be a certificate issued by the bank
Okay.
or a banking statement,
Showing where the money.
any kind of document
Okay.
who confirms that if it's Mr. and Mrs. Richard
Yeah.
purchasing, that it's coming from the bank account from Mr. and Mrs. Richard and not from someone else or from a company.
Good point there. That's just reminded me. Something that you will have to fill in with a notaire is un questionnaire d'état civil, which is, of course, how you sign up in a way for the notaire. It's like giving your details in order to be able for you to put them into your system, and that will be birth certificates. And one topic here, marriage, the type of marriage, because people might not know that, but in France we've got there's several regimes that could be different, and the regime is like this: if it is separation of goods, or if there's a prenup, or something along those lines. And one thing I was quite intrigued by, I don't know if it was with you, I was discussing it, but if the money's coming from a couple that are buying 50-50, but actually not 50-50 of the money is coming in from them, there's maybe something that we need to look at in terms of the contract as well, because if they're not married, for instance, in this case.
Correct.
So the division wouldn't be the same.
That's another topic that we're discussing with the buyer. In which proportions are you going
Yes.
to purchase?
Because if something does go
And
wrong,
does the financing...
if Mr. falls in love with or Madame falls in love with a French waiter,
Correct. We have to anticipate all those...
all those
worst
possible
scenarios.
temptations in France,
Exactly.
right? But so that's we've got to that kind of stage where that's all been defined. That's the role. That's where you will help personally as a notaire. You'll help decide all those things. Without going too much detail into this, we probably should talk about it. We did mention that we'd put this faculté de substitution in there. There is an inheritance rule in France that people must know about. It's demonized a little bit, I think, online. People are making it sound pretty bad. Okay, inheritance tax, inheritance rules, especially if you're divorced, you have kids from a previous marriage. Without going into too much detail, and people can reach out to me and Vincent to ask about this, leave comments below. But if you have got a previous marriage, there are basically two ways of protecting yourself or your other half. One of which is la tontine, which is a status. And the thing is with the tontine is it's not reversible, so maybe not quite as flexible. But
Correct.
so we could go into more detail of tontine. That's not a reason for today. It was just to say that these things are available and don't let that put you off buying a house in France. Yeah. So this company structure, it could be any company actually, isn't it? They are not subject to private individual inheritance tax rules. But then you'd have a notaire to help you through that.
Well, if you
Or
own
the-
if you own shares of a company that owns real estate, then again, it wouldn't.
But there's a wider thing. This is a different conversation. It's just to
Right.
tell the audience
There
there
are-
are solutions.
There are solutions.
We can help you
There-
find those. You don't have to worry about it. That you don't have to worry about those things. There are lots of solutions.
There are ways to optimize. There is no
There's no perfect
solution, but there are ways to improve the situation.
Thanks, Vincent. I think we've got so much to carry on talking about. There were so many intricacies into all of these bits that you can, of course, help with, that we can help with. And if you want to find out more about that, you can, of contact us, and we can put you in touch with Vincent or reach out to Vincent directly. But the point being is that was a great conversation, and thank you so much for coming on the show. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you enjoyed today's podcast. And if you want more information, don't forget to check us out on all the socials, whether that be Instagram, LinkedIn, or of course YouTube. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find more information, book a call with us through our website at frenchconnectionshcb.com. And of course, stay tuned for our next episode on this podcast.